to the cloud. Okay, so hello everybody. My name is Simone Tulumello. I'm a research fellow at the Institute of Social Sciences of the University of Lisbon, and I have the pleasure to introduce this webinar. This is the second of a couple of events on housing in Europe that is organized by the Urban Transitions Hub of our institute. And today's event, in fact, is an idea and a work of Luisa Rossini, who's my colleague at ICS, and she's gonna introduce this event. My role here is just to say hi on behalf of the Urban Transitions Hub, which is this group of urban research at the Institute of Social Sciences, and to say that we're happy to host this second event because at our group we've been working on housing for the last few years, and including in the field of housing mobilizations, particularly within Project Hopes. Last year we organized a discussion during the first months of the pandemic on the early effects on mobilizations, and I link in there the report that came out, which is published on the Radical Housing Journal, which is a journal that if you're here, you should definitely know, but I guess Mara will tell us a bit more afterwards. And so my duty is over. Just we're gonna have 4 presentations divided in 2 sessions. They're gonna be relatively long, well, comfortable presentations, 20-25 minutes each, which some half an hour of time for discussion, and with 10 minutes break, sometimes in 1 hour and a half from now. And so that being said, I will give the floor to Luisa for introducing this seminar and webinar.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you for attending this webinar. And I'm very thankful for the speakers also that accepted to attend today to this discussion that I hope will be very interesting and productive. So I had the pleasure to meet most of them in a collective I was part of in the last year that is called Squatting European Collective. And there we had already a space to discuss several topics, and today I had the opportunity to contact them and select them to talk specifically over the topic of housing crisis and social mobilization in times of COVID, relating the analysis of different European cities. So the idea is a bit to analyze in this context, there is an evolution in power relations between institutions and bottom-up claims. So basically the idea is if today we are in different contexts in which social pressure due to the extraordinary crisis can make it possible for bottom-up claims connected to social justice and housing rights to become more effective and be capable to produce structural changes, achieving goals that weren't capable to achieve before, even after the global crisis of 2008. So this is the big question I asked to our speakers to address today and to tell us how and if that happened in the different contexts they have been analyzing. And this is why today we will start with a Spanish experience of La Paz, and that will be introduced by Miguel Martinez, and the Berlin very interesting actual situation of mobilization asking for a general referendum for the expropriation of big financial companies that owns thousands of apartments in Berlin. And after that, we will have also Margherita introducing us the very peculiar situation that it's present in Rome, with thousands of families, squatters, and immigrants involved in a quite housing dramatic situation. And last but not least, also Marco will introduce us the Lisbon situation about housing crisis and social mobilization. So thank you to everybody for participating today. Sorry, and yeah, I will leave the floor to Mara and the other presenters. Thank you.
Thank you, Simone, and thank you, Luisa, for this introduction and also for inviting me to chair the first part of this webinar. I'm Mara Ferreri. I'm a research fellow in the Department of Geography and Environmental Sciences at Northumbria University in the UK. And I'm also a founder and co-editor of the Radical Housing Journal, which is a journal that we, a few of us, created a couple of years ago. It's already been 4 years. To create a space which is aligned, open access, and free of, and well, like a platform that is readily available to both activists and to scholars to really try and talk about housing struggles and mobilizations for the right to dignified housing across different disciplines, but also to generate some of those transnational dialogues, which we think are so necessary. And if you don't know about this journal, I would warmly recommend that you look it up. And also to look at the report, as Simone was mentioning, written about the webinar that was organized by your organization last year, which was very timely and was very much trying to do what I think this webinar is also doing, which is trying to theorize and trying to share information about the mobilizations that are happening on the ground. So I don't want to take too much space. So I would like, well, first of all, to introduce the first two speakers of this session. The first presentation will be by Miguel Martinez, who is Professor of Housing and Urban Sociology at the Institute for Housing and Urban Research at Uppsala University in Sweden, who is going to talk about housing activism in Spain and thinking about what kind of crisis has COVID-19 exacerbated, but also what are the persistent structures, both in terms of the crisis situations around housing and access to fair and dignified housing, but also the structures of organization in Spain. The second speaker today is Armin Kuhn, who is advisor of the left parliamentarian group in the German Bundestag and activist of the Stadt von Unten, Berlin, who is going to be talking particularly about the tenants movement in Berlin and the acceleration of those struggles during COVID-19 pandemic. What I would propose to do is for Miguel to start with his presentation and then perhaps leave about 5 minutes for urgent questions or point of clarification from the floor. If there are any questions, please maybe just put it in the chat. And then to move to Armin's presentation and finally dedicate a good half an hour for more general questions related to two presentations and really to try and foment that transnational reflection that we were talking about at the beginning and that I think this webinar is very much the platform for. So without further ado, I would ask Miguel to present.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. And also very nice to see many colleagues and friends. So I hope my presentation will suggest any questions or reflections afterwards. This is a very, very general overview about what's going on in Spain lately, but I also want to give some historical background. I cannot describe all the housing struggles going on in Spain, so I will probably be a bit superficial about them. But so, well, can I share my screen?
Sure, it
okay.
should be possible.
Yeah. Okay. So the title of my presentation is Housing Activism in Spain, Another Crisis to Face, but Persistent Structures to Change. So I want to present 3 arguments, even if I said they are very descriptive overview about the main features of the housing situation and the housing struggles in Spain. I still think that there are at least 3 key aspects to consider. First of one is that housing activism has been mostly boosted by the most critical periods of economic recession, but also by the general dynamics of capitalist growth, even more than by prefigurative movements. despite that there are some cases as new forms of cooperative housing, and of course the squatting movement, which is still very active nowadays in Spain. So my main argument is that we can see a growth of housing struggles in the moments of crisis, but we cannot explain this growth without paying attention to the circumstances that promote capitalist growth, especially in the real estate sector. Then I also argue that the COVID-19 crisis has added some problems, but many structural conditions and grievances that were born during the dictatorship until the 70s are still persistent in the Spanish housing system. My second argument today is to claim that anti-evictions, squatting, and tenants organizing are still the leading the housing movement in a more established, diverse movement than some years before, I would say 10 years before. But their state counterparts have shaped the new struggles conditions in very dissatisfactory manner, despite of what many people think from abroad, that the new progressive government is facilitating things to housing activism. And that's not true. In particular, I want to point out to the failed promises of rent regulation, the new housing law, and the evictions moratorium. All of them were a failure, and they're still a failure even after so much discussion and controversy. And in continuation with that, I will argue that most of the policy outcomes which are won by housing struggles can only be identified at the medium or long term perspective. And finally, that will be very superficial. I don't think I will have time for that, but perhaps is what is of the most interest for activists. I don't know how many are they today here. I think that housing organizations face challenges such as the need to respond to the overlapping political economy conditions, both the persistent ones and the emergent ones. They also should improve their internal and transnational cooperation, but also with other movements, as history has shown. And finally, they should legitimize or keep legitimizing their strategies and the resistance, and also their alternatives, especially in times of valley mobilizations of the protest cycle. So first of all, I want to recall one graph I was creating over the last month in order to synthesize the history of housing struggles in Spain since the dictatorship. I'm only focusing on the last decades of the dictatorship, because in that period, these four conditions, the promotion of home ownership, disinvestment in social housing, the shortage of affordable housing, and the boost of tourism and construction, these conditions were created, were promoted by the state, and were and are still defining most of the features of the housing system in Spain. So they are also the source of most of the grievances that movements, housing movements, and other kind of urban movements have been trying to react to respond to, and to create alternatives to over the years. But of course, this is not an easy thing. So in different periods, in the 70s in particular, around 1975, there was a peak of mobilizations in which different social movements, including some housing mobilizations and demands, were more or less successful in solving some of the problems. But of course, the most persistent structures were still there. The same happened during the 1990s, and in particular at the peak moments of mobilization in 1992 and around 2000, but also, of course, in the final period around 2011, and around basically 3 years until 2013, 2014. But of course, what I'm trying to see is that these structural conditions of the pioneering real estate neoliberal policies implemented by the dictatorial regime were supplemented with new policies over the years and new conditions of the evolution of capitalism, of real estate capitalism in Spain. In particular, I'm just mentioning here a few of them. like the promotion of the housing bubble, the increasing of vacancy rates, and the increasing financialization of the system. There are many other things related to the cycles of the movements and many other things. So at the bottom of the graph, you can see the different reactions and the different types of movements that were more prominent in each of these periods. So I did this graph before the pandemic, or just during the first months of the pandemic. So definitely I need to add many more things to that for the new situations. So I would like to stress now in the following slides what I consider the most important housing conditions during the pandemic, and also the most important housing struggles during the same period. So first of all, we need to be aware that the financialization wave didn't stop during the pandemic. It was recovered after 2013, 2014, due to different policies and circumstances. And the introduction, the taking over by international investors, real estate investment trusts, and Walter funds in Spain has been completely new, at least in the size and dimension. Even when we experienced something similar around 1986, when there was the connection, the inclusion of Spain in the economic European community at that time. The rates of indebtedness in Spain, both private and public, never stop growing, which is quite, this raises many concerns because the economy is quite weak, and this can reflect partially also housing inflation and the increasing prices in housing. Quite important thing is that after the crisis, after 2009, 2010, the whole financial sector was under restructure, and there was a new bank created by the state, a sort of bank, a financial entity, which is nowadays under the risk of default, and this will increase the debt of the state, because it's the state who is going to pay, even if the benefits, the profits of this company all go to the private financial entities. There are now we live, especially during the pandemic, but also in the previous years, a situation in which home ownership is much more limited, but it's still growing, even despite the limitations in terms of mortgage lending. And of course, tourism-related housing speculation was growing all the time in the aftermath of the crisis, but it was stagnated partially, only temporarily during the pandemic. So all these circumstances are quite conditioning and shaping the circumstances for the movement. So this is just a graph to represent how indebtedness rates in Spain are still super high, despite some decrease during the peak moments of the crisis around 2008, but still nowadays is incredibly high. It's also related to the economic recession, which under the last year in 2020, it was minus 11%, is really huge. And this has also consequences in terms of unemployment, but not much, as you can see, in terms of housing prices. So the inflation is still growing and growing. And now we are again with rates of growth around 50% in most of the communities, but in particular in Catalonia, Madrid, and the Balearic Islands. So the situation is still quite terrible for most people who cannot afford housing. These are the representation of an unemployment rate, which is still above 15%. So this means that there is no clear recovery for most people, for most of the population, of the working class population in Spain, despite the growing investments, the growing inflation in housing prices, and so on and so forth. And this is the average should be in between men and women, but of course, women, migrants, and young people are always suffering the most in this situation. So the second point I want to stress is that the new progressive government at the state level between the socialist and the new left populist, Podemos, Unidas Podemos, has been a failure in terms of all the expectations that were around housing when they took office. So the promised new housing law and the rent regulations were postponed due to many pressures of capital. The rent regulations were implemented in Catalonia. In the last days, there was a new move by the government, the state government, the national government, who is now appealing these regulations, but is not suspending these regulations in Catalonia. But still, they are not fulfilling the promises that they had in the beginning of their mandate. So this is quite problematic, to say the least. They also implemented a moratorium for evictions, but only in very particular case of emergency, vulnerability, without housing alternative, and that has been completely ineffective. Thousands and thousands of cases of home evictions have been produced during the pandemic. And this means that housing struggles were still going on. There were more subsidies for constructors and landlords, or they are to come, because the new plans by the government are just subsidizing capital instead of subsidizing people and residents. And this is also part of the new plans approved by the European Union just today. So there is probably not many changes in this respect. This is just one banner made by the PA saying that between January and March of this year, there were 11,000 home evictions in Spain. Some of them were due to rent arrears, to mortgage arrears, or to squatting. So that's very confusing figure. But still, this can give an indication of how problematic is the situation. And of course, the result is that people need to rise up and struggle against these conditions. And finally, I think that during the pandemic, the stay-at-home rules have widened the social gaps in housing and workers' conditions. Many homeless people had no place where to go. There was an increase of housing and labor precarity, in particular for many domestic workers. There was a reappreciation in parallel of housing values and growing inflation. So there was no crisis in the housing market. And at the same time, there was a rise of suburbia and sprawl housing and markets related to domestic work and services. So there is a new economic boom associated to the crisis, to the pandemic crisis, which is only benefiting capital. Finally, if we move on to the housing struggles, I think that the most important thing I want to stress in the beginning is that in the first period of the pandemic, there were many rent strikes in different cities of Spain. And curiously, they were not very well organized. They were very spontaneous and very scattered, but really incredible, because this is a great novelty since 1930s in Spain. So we didn't have this sort of rent strikes. And this is, in my opinion, a crucial test for the future empowerment of tenants. In parallel, there were positive conditions for individualized rent negotiations at the first stage of the pandemic shock. But this happened mostly with middle class or individual landlords, not so much with corporate landlords. It happened too, but that was part of that. So these were some of the posters in order to call for this rent strike. Second aspect I mentioned in the presentation is that I think it's now we are experiencing a new stage in housing struggles in which there is more diversity. It's not only the PA that for the last 10 years was so successful leading the anti-eviction movement in connection to post-15M organizations. But nowadays, there are many other small groups of tenants, of neighborhood associations. There is, of course, the tenants, the biggest tenants associations in some of the big cities. And there are many other minor struggles, especially against corporate landlords like Blackstone and many others. All these who have created this real investment, real estate investment trust in Spain, because they basically don't pay taxes. So the legislation is very favorable for them. So they don't have the same names in Spain. At the same time, there were increasing negotiations with authorities and private corporate landlords, which is also a novelty compared to previous housing movements, or in particular with the squatting movement. So now most of these housing movements and housing struggles and campaigns are usually targeting authorities and landlords to achieve some kind of benefits, concessions, new legislations, and so on and so forth. So there is more institutional action by these movements than 10 years before. But of course, they still combine this with a lot of direct action, like squatting, blockades, demonstrations, etc., etc. Quite important also to press the government, the national government, are all these campaigns for new housing legislation that have been successful in some regional governments, autonomous communities in Spain. And there are also new campaigns for social housing, or reactivated campaigns, because this campaign has been here from the beginning that the Sareb was created. But now that the Sareb is selling most of their assets, people are really concerned that we are just going to pay the debt again. It's 50,000 million euros that we are going, probably not all, but part of that, to pay with public money. So this is just a poster to celebrate the 10 years of anniversary of the PA. These were just some a national assembly in the beginning of the pandemic in January in Madrid. And this is just an illustration of one of the multiple campaigns against corporate landlords. In this particular case is La Sora, one of the rates in Spain. And this is an action last week by the Sindicat de Llogaters, the tenants union in Catalonia, against the failure or the attempt of the government to cancel rent regulations in Catalonia. Final slide about the housing struggles, and then I will move to the conclusions. Please let me know how many minutes more I have.
You have about 4 minutes.
Okay, good, thank you. So I think it's quite important to remark that this evictions moratorium decided by the government was not very effective. There were some cases, of course, some thousands of cases. It's still in effect until August 2021, but home evictions were still going on, and they created like a chaos, because even demonstrations and protests were very difficult during the pandemic. But after a few months of shock, I would say, people became again to go to the streets and to defend people threatened with eviction. And I think this is quite remarkable that the movement is still alive despite all the restrictions. It was especially difficult to implement this moratorium in cases of squatting and non-officially recognized vulnerability or unavailable housing alternatives for different circumstances, in particular for migrant people who have no ways to demonstrate their vulnerability and to navigate all the bureaucracy related to that. And of course, housing alternatives are not provided by municipalities or by governments, so people were really in critical conditions. So the anti-evictions repertoire continued, and there were also multiple dimensions of anti-poverty struggles related to electricity supplies, to food, to health, and so on and so forth. So that was also a revival of struggles, even in a moment in which most of the movements were in a valley, in a retreat. They were not so active before the pandemic. So the pandemic somehow reactivated most of these movements, and housing became one of the key centers of this reactivation. So just to conclude, I want to argue that a theoretically friendly or light government was not very responsive to housing movements pressures, but some little victories have been won and grassroots mobilization is still rolling out. This indicates more likely long-term policy outcomes of housing struggles. So we are expecting that some of these victories could be achieved in the short term. There is a novelty in terms of diversity among housing organizations and campaigns, with a more established repertoire of hybrid autonomy, combining more institutional and private negotiations, legal initiatives, campaigns against corporate landlords, but also direct actions of resistance, like such as squatting and anti-evictions blockades. And the current housing movements need to identify their various opponents, state and European institutions, financial corporations, both national and international, but also middle-class landlords, because this is a very important issue I cannot develop here today. And their strategies in terms of profit-driven and rent-seeking actions and lobbying authorities, and global and local trends of capital accumulation in the real estate sector. Finally, they should also strengthen the coordination of campaigns and activist groups, both locally, statewide, and transnationally, but also widen their alliances with other social movements, urban reproductive syndicalism, and intersectional workers' struggles, because we need to admit that this coordination is not so good, and so effective, and the potential is there. So given this new boom of these struggles. Yeah, that's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Miguel. It's been a very, very rich and quite dense presentation, but I think it offers a really good overview of the structural dimensions of the current struggles. And I've also noticed that Luisa has put now in the chat some links to something which just kind of is the sad and terrible evidence of exactly what you were saying in terms of the failure of this moratorium on eviction. It's the case of a man who committed suicide a couple of days ago.
Terrible.
And in that case, it was someone who had been recognized by the local social services, who had, had ticked all the boxes and was in rent arrears since last summer. So there are also some indications that clearly the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic downturn and the impossibility of some people to access any sort of support is beginning to show now also in terms of increasing eviction. So it's clearly a point of inflection, and it's definitely something that there probably will be more of. I wonder if there are any questions, like urgent questions specific to the presentation for Miguel. If anyone wants to pop it in the chat. And if not, maybe you could just hold your thought and then we can listen to Armin's presentation. And then we can have a proper conversation between the two presentations and really thinking about this question, and particularly, I think, drawing out some of the similarities and differences around this, the subject position of the tenant, which is certainly one of the critical sites of mobilizations currently. Shall we do that? Okay, so thank you, Miguel. And Armin, it's to you.
Yes, hello, and thanks for the invitation. Thanks, Miguel, for your presentation. I'm very happy that you had to be before me, because I think I can pick up a lot of your arguments, also for the Berlin case. I also prepared a little presentation, so I will try to get it on the screen. Do we have it like this?
We can see it.
Okay. Okay. So yeah, I will talk about the Berlin tenant movement, which is obviously not an isolated movement, not isolated in context of different statal levels, and neither isolated by other movements out of Berlin, but also within Berlin in other sections. But I think it's really a strong movement, maybe the strongest movement in Berlin in the last 10 years. So I think it might be very insightful to have a keener look on it. First of all, to the context, I think these kind of numbers are very familiar with all of you in your cities. We have almost rent increase in the last 10 years by 100% or more than 100%. So rents doubled in the last 10 years. Even more, or the growth was even stronger in the land prices, where we have a percentage of 670% in 10 years. We have also a population growth in Berlin by almost 300,000 people. And so we have a housing shortage. But most of all, we have a shortage in the affordable apartments by about 100,000 apartments missing for people with an average income, which is in Berlin about 2,000 euro a month. One factor of it was also the decrease of the social housing stock, which was about 150,000 social housing apartments 10 years ago, and which is now by like 90,000 or even less. And we also have a big problem with evictions of apartments, which is now at an average of 12 evictions a day in Berlin. When we have the federal numbers, we are almost at the same level as the numbers Miguel had. We had in the last numbers we have are from 2019, and they were at 45,000 evictions in Germany. So quite a strong problem. And what we see here is like 10-year like time slab with this kind of development, which is, I think, not coincidental, because it's exactly the time starting from the financial crisis 2008 until now. And I think we have a very different impact of the financial crisis here in Berlin than in Spain or in Italy, or even at most of all than in Greece. But we have a significant impact, which is different, which is that Germany, and especially Berlin, became, I would say, the center of attention by international capital for real estate investment. And that's one of the key drivers in the development of the housing market, apart from the factors Miguel also presented, which are the same in Germany: promotion of home ownership, disinvestment in social housing, the shortage of affordable housing, and also a construction and tourism boom, which is in Berlin also. We can notice in Berlin also. But the financialization is a key factor. Also very different is the impact of the COVID pandemic. We have quite an active tenant movement this year and last year. I will come to that later. But it's totally contrary, as I understood it from Miguel from Spain. The pandemic didn't activate or reactivate any initiative or any struggle within the tenant movement. It's in the contrary. The pandemic really demobilized the movement in the first place, because all the restrictions with the pandemic really impeded the initiative to meet, to organize actions. There was a very high sensibility for the pandemic within the left scene. We have a high conflict about the measures taken by the pandemic between the left on the one hand and the right on the other hand. The right very much mobilizing against any measures concerning the pandemic. And this led to a very cautious relation by leftist and movement groups with the pandemic. So there were hardly actions apart from very single mobilization, like the Black Matters movement mobilization and these kind of things. So that was, at the first place, it was a very demobilizing impact. But still, we have a lot of activity, and I think to explain it more, we have to go a little bit back into the history of the Berlin Tenant Movement to understand the dynamic of the movement now. The tenant movement started about 12 years ago. First, I have to say how I explain what's my analysis of the tenant movement. I try now to give you a little like chronology of the movement development, but at the same time, these are different aspects or different struggles within the tenant movement, which weren't like consecutive, but kind of opened up a diversification of the movement in this different struggles and different parts. So the first struggle of the beginning tenant movement was the mobilizations against the waterfront development, which was in a context of a still very affordable housing market and with a quite good access to housing, very different from today, but still with very strong processes of gentrification in the inner city districts going on already. So this waterfront development was noted or conceived of as a boost of gentrification, really, like this kind of waterfront mobility we know from other cities as well. And this kind of mobilization was really the core of the tenant movement by now. You can even see it by different persons. You still meet in different initiatives and in different actions, which were then like beginning this kind of struggles. And now the struggle against like luxury new building projects is still going on. Not there anymore in this area. It's quite lost actually. Most of the houses you see there are standing now, but the struggle went on to other places within Berlin. A second big landmark within the tenant movement development was the Coty building by the initiative Coty Co, which is a social housing initiative at Cottbusser Tor in Kreuzberg. And the Coty is out of a Turkish tradition, a building built up within one night. And they did it within one street festival they organized. And since then, since 2012, this is really a emblematic space for the Berlin tenant movement, although it's very little and sweet, but still it's a very a core space for the movement organization. And there were several aspects of tenant struggles addressed by this movement and this local space. One is the privatization of public housing, because these blocks where this initiative organized was one of the blocks privatized in 2002, also by a left coalition. 60,000 apartments privatized in one deal. And the consequences of this deal are very high rising rents, very bad conditions of the building, disinvestment, and also quite violent behavior. And how should I put it? Quite violent relation towards the tenants in this building, complaining about things. This is one struggle within it, and the other one is the disinvestment in social housing, which is in Germany a system. I don't know, maybe in other countries as well, a system which is more like a social intermediate use. So for a couple of years, 10, 15, maybe 20 years, there's a lower rent. And after that, the apartments can be rented to market prices again. And so this was a moment, 2012, where it started that these apartments were affected by the end of this social immediate use. In the same year, very much inspired by the PAR movement in Spain, anti-eviction campaigns became a very strong part of the Berlin tenant movement. Big mobilization against evictions, and which addressed like this very violent aspect of the housing market, which in this area was very much stronger than today. There were about a double in the numbers of evictions by then, like 20-25 evictions a day, where this initiative started to rally against. 2015 was another key point where a movement coalition by then. So it's like a first sign of a diversification of the tenant movement within different struggles, which came back together in this referendum campaign, which rallied for social politics within public housing. So basically a campaign that public housing is not for profits, but public housing needs a very strong rent regulation, needs a very strong that public housing is for the people which are most needed of affordable housing, and they had a draft of a law in Berlin level which is a kind of a system change within public housing. They wanted, and they collected signatures for. In the end, this was a part-time success. I will come to it later, but a very important moment also in the development of the tenant movement in Berlin. By 2017, more or less, there surged a new kind of struggle within the tenant movement, which is really interesting because before the tenant movement was, as in Spain, very much led by experienced activists out of the former squatting movement, out of autonomous leftist free spaces, out of different areas of other movements, but like clear-cut left activists building the core of the tenant movement initiatives before. And since 2007, and this is very much connected also to the development of the housing market, there is the struggles of single houses mobilizing their neighborhood against the purchase of their house to financial investors. So in this movement, the picture you see, this is like very typical, having the front of the houses with all the slogans, which is my house actually, because I was in this struggle also in the beginning of the year, where the people of the house themselves tried to mobilize and to organize, and which is within a very specific institutional context, because the city has the right to intervene in these housing purchases and to overtake the contract if they find the money for it, and if they find a public housing company to take it over. And this is also this has to be used, this right by the city, within 2 months. So this mobilization of this houses within these houses was like a very accelerated like mobilization process, which kind of built a housing scene in this double sense of different houses making the same experience and like being in discussion and being in the older houses give their knowledge to the next house affected. So this led to a huge diversification of the movement, a lot of new people into the movement, and a very different character of movement mobilizations also, which was ongoing all the time and very much accelerated in the last years, was the displacement of left projects and spaces, which goes on very much independent which kind of government is in charge in Berlin. If it's a conservative government, which was before, or a leftist progressive government by now. I wouldn't discuss now what could be done or not be done by the governments. The fact is that the financialization of the housing market and the growing prices and the growing interest of investors makes it every year and every month more difficult for left spaces to persist. On the other hand, we see since 2018 a massive mobilization. Like this is kind of establishing an annual rally, not only in Berlin but also in other cities, of mass demonstrations against the housing crisis. This picture is from 2019, where we had in Berlin about 50,000 people on the streets. And there were parallel manifestations in Cologne, in Munich, in Leipzig, and in different cities. So we had like at least 80,000 up to 100,000 people on the streets in 2019. And exactly here in this mass mobilizations, we see the effect of the COVID-19 pandemic, because there was a very big housing action day, was then called, planned in 2020 in March. 1 year later than this demonstration you see on the picture. And this mobilization housing action day with 50 cities all over Europe taking part in it, obviously didn't take place because of the pandemic. And this was very, was kind of a shock for the movement. Which really was a rupture in the dynamic which was going on in the years before. Now, and this is like the actual moment of the tenant movement. There's the campaign since 2019 for the expropriation of major real estate companies. So we have, as an effect of the privatizations and of the disinvestment in social housing, about, nobody knows exactly, but about 260,000 apartments in Berlin, which belong to major real estate companies, defined to be companies with more than 3,000 apartments each. And this campaign uses an article in the German Constitution, which was never implemented, which is an article for the socialization of certain public goods. And the land, the socialization of land, is one of the possibilities given by this article. Others are like car industries or like nutrition, production of nutrition, and like these core sectors, and land is one of it. And this campaign now rallies for the implementation of this constitutional article in Berlin. And this movement is really a consequence or a fusion or a merger somehow of different tenant movements. The movement before I presented with the Gecekondu of against privatization and disinvestment social housing. A movement I didn't mention yet on the single house level against the modernization, like luxury modernization of different houses, which was one of the organizing cause of this campaign, where an organizing initiative entered a neighborhood which was very much affected of this luxury modernization by one of these big real estate companies, Deutsche Wohnen, German Living or German Housing, which is the core of the campaign, or one of the cores of the campaign. But also there's a campaign of against not against the campaign for a different system of public housing, which now is the aim of this expropriation campaign, to get these financialized real estate apartments into a new system of social public housing. And so in this struggle, a lot of these former tenant movement merged. And this is also an explanation why at this moment, despite of the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, that this movement is working. And by the way, it's the only movement working really within the tenant movement at the moment. But there, all the forces of the tenant movement are concentrated now in the collection of signatures, which had to be ended next week, and they have to collect 175,000 signatures by German citizens resident in Berlin, which obviously is difficult because there are a lot of non-German citizens resident in Berlin. So there's a very big problem of really getting this signatures, but it can be done, I hope so. Another part of the story is, or of the dynamics of the movement from the analysis of it, is to see that there was a lot of policy impact by this movement ongoing in the last years. We have like an Alliance for Social Housing Policy, which was in the moment that the movement with the Con, with the Coty Co movement started. There was an immediate response by the by the public housing companies with very little impact, but there was a response. The second response was the reintroduction of social housing promotion or subsidies, which were stopped 10 years ago because of austerity measures in Berlin at the beginning of the 2000s. There was a housing supply act on Berlin level, which was the immediate outcome of the campaign for the system change in public housing, which was not exactly the law they prepared or gave into discussion, but was in reaction on the Senate, and they took a certain part of the campaign and put it into the new law. And a very, I think, a very strong role the tenant movement played for the election of a progressive left government coalition, which was in parts also in negotiations of taking up the demands of the tenant movement into the government agenda. I wouldn't say it's a municipalist, how you say it, municipalist government. I wouldn't go that far, but there was very strong communication and a very strong overtaking of demands of the tenant movement into this coalition, which was a policy impact by the mobilizations of the years before. We have 1 year later a cooperation agreement of the municipal housing companies, which were like a lot of more concrete, especially institutionalizing a rent cap within the public housing by 30% of the income of the tenant, and introduce quotas for the allocation of special need groups like homeless people, migrant people who are discriminated against in the housing market, and so on. And the commitment to extend the housing sector by buying housing and by new building also. Another one was a rent freeze in municipal housing and public housing in 2017. So since then, the public housing companies can only increase the rent by 1% per year. And the biggest policy impact by now was the rent price cap implemented in 2020, which had the element of a rent freeze in all apartments in Berlin, which had a rent cap, which were based on the rents of more or less 8 years before, not like a market level cap, but a cap supposed to be before the big tension in the market. And you had also the element of the reduction of rents, which for some of the people was really hundreds of euros per month. This rent cap was ended on court in April this year. The Constitutional Court said that the city of Berlin has not the competence for this kind of law. So now this struggle, as many others, move into federal level. So coming to my conclusions, as Miguel also said, for Spain, the development of the movement and of the housing struggle follow very much the dynamics we see in the housing market. I would say the main factor in the Berlin housing market is financialization. And what you can see is that with every policy impact of the movement and every additional regulation, the real estate companies, the investors, the property owners find new business models for new profits. So when they started to just increase the rents and kick out people by evictions, they went on by buying former social housing and building out of it big real estate companies we deal with now. We had the luxury modernization I talked about, which was ended by federal legislation, not ended, but more regulated by federal law. And now we have more a business model of buying single houses and convert them to condominiums, to property ownership, which obviously is not affordable for the tenants living in. And so the housing struggles are developing along this development of the market, which is very much affected by the legislations the tenant struggle fought for or gained as a success of their struggles. What is curious about the movement is that you can see a further radicalization in the movement. Like the tenant movement, as it was not so much formed by radical movements as in Spain, I suppose, but more formed by tenant activists, which had an activist core, but was always only one part of it. We have a start with more or less moderate demands, like cap the rents in social housing, don't do profit maximization in public housing and so forth, very like institutional directed demands, going on up to the expropriation demand, or the demand for rent reduction and not only rent freeze, which is a lot more radical than in the beginning. And at the same time, we note an increasing approval by the population in Berlin for this more radical demands, which is a consequence of the housing market development, but also a consequence of a political polarization we have not only in housing but also in housing. And as I said, the COVID-19 pandemic had a little impact in all this in all this dynamics. I think the factors that we now have such a movement mobilization peak with the expropriation campaign come from far beyond, or from the last from all what I tried to analyze or try to describe more now of struggle of the last years. And the COVID-19 pandemic had more the impact of demobilizing in the first sense, and then concentrating everything on this expropriation campaign, because this campaign was like going on. Other struggles were like more in a difficult situation. And we had like ongoing the struggles of the single houses against their purchases, which also is kind of influencing or like developing into the expropriation campaign as the key struggle we have in the moment. And the other movement we have is now that with the fall of the rent price cap, we have a shift of the struggles to the federal level, because there the tenant laws are made, and all the tenant struggles in Berlin and in other cities always like very limited on what they could gain because of this federal legislation they couldn't address. Yes, I think for the moment that would be it.
Thank you, Armin, very much for this. And I think it's a very good point to end on. Also thinking about the ways in which some of the gains of the mobilizations of the past 10 years in different cities have somehow got some victories, at the same time also received and being on the receiving end of recapturing of the strength of these movements. And that was what Miguel was saying in relation to Spain, and particularly the attempts at rent regulation in Catalonia, and how that scale of the conflict kind of clashes with what is the kind of a higher level court. So I think it's very interesting in that sense to think about these parallels of what has been gained in relatively short period of time, and also thinking about perhaps what are these local struggles and how they intersect with this wider, more systemic, not just national, but also European level recoding and recapturing of the territories of struggles around housing. So I don't want to take time, because I'm conscious of time, and I would like people who are listening in to make some comments or have some questions, and perhaps we could take a couple of questions. So if you're interested in asking a question, please put your name in the chat, and so I can take note of who's speaking. Okay, I see Luisa. Do you want to start?
Yes, I will break the ice. Thank you. Thank you very much, Miguel and Armin. I wanted to wait for my last comments or questions, because I thought that the two cases were very interesting to be listened one after the other, let's say. So in fact, my main question that emerged from also the first event we organized about housing financialization was about the possibility that housing financialization is also at the end producing an effect of depoliticization of movements, of housing movements. And I'm asking that, for example, the case of Berlin looks to me quite evident in certain terms, but also the Spanish one, when we refer to the political asset as something that, while governing the conservatives or the most progressist parties, we still have some kind of same effect in terms of politics. And so, for example, in terms of Berlin, all this luxury modernization, the greening of formal housing, social housing that were sold to big companies with the deal that prices couldn't be rise, but then with the excuse of making them more green, according to the Green Deal, prices were doubled, sometimes of 200% in few years. and that for sure produced terrible effects on tenants, sell out of public properties with introduction of very weird policies like calculatorische Kosten that was introduced 2005 in Berlin, and was basically saying that every public property that wasn't used enough was going to cost in terms of taxes so much to public institutions that was much better to sell them, and that was one factor that pushed a lot of public properties privatization. I mean, I see all of that into the main pattern of financialization of housing, but as we were analyzing last time in our first event, as pushed by institutions, or at least supported by institutions policies and strategies. And that makes very complicated for movements to identify some subject to refer to in the political terms to push for their requests in institutional terms, because the question is to whom to refer to. And we saw also, I referred to the case, Roman case, for example, we saw during the 90s, the progressive distancing of bottom-up movements, social movements related to housing or other forms of space appropriation that were progressively detaching from parties, leftist parties, because there wasn't any more identification of goals. And yeah, so a form of, I'm using this strong word, depolitization, but in a, I think it's one of the key points that I also see in the Spanish case. Also because, for example, what you mentioned at the end about the rent cap law that was at the end discussed by the institutional court that say that wasn't the municipal right to define that the same happened in Paris recently, and something like that happened recently here in Spain. So I mean, and that is also related to what Miguel was saying of Spanish context of laws and rules that allows or not allows to change certain patterns. So my question to close that is if you consider that related to your analysis too. Sorry for the long question.
Thank you, Luisa. Maybe we can collect another question, because I've seen that Rita Silva also wanted to ask a question, so we can get both of them, and then Miguel and Armin can respond. Rita.
Okay. Yes. Hello. Thank you for the presentations. I'm sorry, I don't have a camera in my computer, so I cannot appear. I have some questions for both cases, and it was very good, the presentations. I really want to continue to read and to talk with these researchers. And well, I wanted to ask first to Miguel about the Spanish case. Well, I have my own thoughts, but I would like to know your opinion about why this left government is having so much difficulty to address the housing question, knowing that in Spain the housing is in the center of the political agenda, and the housing movements are strong. Why is it being so difficult for them to act? I have some clues, but I would like to know your opinion about that. And also because I think that at other scales, like at municipal level and at the Catalonia level, you have some other alliances that promote other kinds of things. So I would like to know your opinion about that. And also, despite the diversification that you talked, do you think that the housing movement is turning into a tenant movement, or not really? Another question I would have to Armin is about you talked a little bit about that, about how the movement is reacting to this defeat by the Constitutional Court. because you said that the only movement, I think you said the only movement existing now or active now is very much focused on the expropriation. But do you think there is any kind of chance to build the coalition at federal level? Because I have my doubts about that. And these, you mentioned different kinds of victories at the policy level, but I had the impression that these victories are all in the municipal level or at the state level, if it is true. So do you think there is any kind of capacity to react at this federal level? And yeah, and I think that these two cases show, well, they show different kinds of relations between the social movement and the left interlocution when left is in the government. And there are cases that it is a good reciprocity, and other cases that is not. So I would like you to just comment about that if it is okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rita. I forgot to ask you to introduce yourself, from which organization or movement you're coming from.
Me, I'm a Portuguese. I'm from, in fact, I'm from the social movement in Portugal, in Lisbon, and I'm from Habita, a housing movement that struggles for the right to housing. But also I'm studying, I'm doing a PhD in political economy, and I'm struggling with the financialization at the academic level. Yes.
Thank you. So if Miguel or Armin, who wants to start? There are quite a few good questions there, and we have about 10 minutes before the coffee break, maybe 15 if we can stretch it, if the organizers allow. So.
Okay, maybe, can I start?
Sure.
Okay, first question on financialization and depoliticization of movements. I think that first of all, we need to be aware that financialization is not just one avenue. It has many branches. Many things can be financialized. Many things can be subject to debt. And those who rule the market of debt, the market of money, can shift completely from one market to another. The important thing is that housing has become one of the key markets for them in the last 20 years. And that's something new, but of course this can change tomorrow. And the same about home ownership. Home ownership is not new. In many Southern European countries is the main form of tenure of housing. But in the past, it was also financialized. People had to ask for a debt, for a loan, for a mortgage, but they could pay back the loan immediately in 3, 4, 5 years. Of course, it was financialized, but it was not a huge issue. So it was impossible to expect reactions against that. And it was also very much under control of local banks with some social participation and political regulations. So the problem is when everything is out of control. It's not only companies like banks or investors coming from abroad, is that they are completely deregulated. They can move money from one country to another. They don't pay taxes. They lobby all politicians to follow to their return rate. That's what they are expecting. That's the only thing that really moved them. And they change completely the landscape. So it's not, I would say, it's not just financialization which provokes movement. It's certain strategies and styles of certain corporations, global corporations, specialized in investments and debt, who are responsible to create this outrage and these reactions. But not always, because in the moments of growth, people can still be indebted for many reasons, not only for buying houses, for consumption and for many other things. They don't react against these predatory actors in society, and they don't ask the government to control them much, and so on and so forth. So I think the problem is is really deep. And you are right, Luisa, that in some of the aspects of financialization, society is not reacting against. Basically, it's colonizing most of our lives, our jobs, and many of the goods that we consume are always subject to financialization, but only in certain moments and in certain circumstances, like happened in Spain in the last 10 years. Some people, some groups can react against that. And that was the case of housing, because that was the basis of the economic growth in Spain for almost 10 years. So I think it's a complex thing. It's not just finances produce more or less politicization. It's that only some aspects of financialization are able to produce that when many other things happen. And I also want to insist that, especially in my presentation, I wanted to emphasize that we need to pay attention to these dynamics of investment and housing markets and housing policies. But at the same time, we need to look at the coalitions with different movements and the peaks of mobilizations, the peaks of the protest cycles, because we see that housing struggles are more successful when many other people are also mobilizing for other things, or when they manage to lead mobilizations somehow. And that's not always easy. So that happened to the PA after 2014, 15, when the municipalist governments won very big cities in Spain, at least 7. And then all of a sudden, these friendly alliances didn't pay back much as the movement expected. Because in Spain also, something that was asked before is that it's also a complex institutional structure where the state can decide some things about housing, but most of the powers on housing are on the regional governments. So movements need to navigate these different structures. At the local level, they can ask for some benefits, social work, and some alternative housing or emergency housing. But the regional level is where they have the power to enact legislation that can be progressive. And the PAB, for example, tried very much in some regional communities to do so. But of course, the state, for example, has the power to regulate rents or to set the general basis for all the regional governments and the local governments to regulate that. But also social housing. Social housing cannot be provided by the state. The state can give subsidies, can set general guidelines, but it's the regional governments who have to do the social housing. And of course, many of them are under conservative government. It's not the progressive government of the state. But why this progressive government coalition, minority coalition between Podemos and the socialists, the social democrats, did nothing almost on the field of housing? Well, first, it's a matter of negotiation between the two parties, and in parliament, it's not easy. But on the other hand, the social democrats is the powers that be. They are the power holders. They never wanted to change the power structure on the housing system at all. So most of the times that they were in government, in the general guidelines, it's a 5 years plan for housing, they never changed the basic structures, structural conditions of the housing system in Spain. So it's quite difficult to expect that they will change. On top of that, they have the Ministry of Economy is in the hands of the Social Democrats, and she is a very, very extreme right, let's say liberal right politician who is basically following all the instructions by the Central European Bank and by all the investors and the owners of the debt of Spain. I said in one of my slides that basically the whole country, 4 times the general gross product of Spain, domestic product of Spain, is on the hands of foreigners, investors, banks, vulture funds, etc. So the country is not ours. All the production we have is not ours. We are basically colonized by them. So it depends who is in the government, that you just want to pay back all this debt, or you just want to calm down things. And well, basically this government is responding to this international interest And we are almost in the same situation as we were in 2008. So in the risk of default all the time. Well, the final question was, to what extent the housing movement can evolve into a tenants movement? This is quite unlikely. First of all, because around 80%, 87%, now it's a bit less, it's 85, 80 something percent of tenure housing in Spain is homeownership. So it's around 15%, which is rental housing. And on the other hand, most of the corporate landlords are reaching the end of the cycle of investment. So they were renting because it was very profitable. They didn't pay taxes. They also gained a new legislation, which was canceled, rental legislation by the previous government, which was very favorable for them to raise rents. But now they accumulated so much wealth that they probably are starting to sell and to turn most of their assets into private ownership again. So it's not clear that this cycle of increasing rentals are going to last for too long. And the majority of the population is still owning, and they want to own. And that's now the competition between owning or buying and renting is even more complicated than before, but still the interest rates are very low. So once the banking system becomes again more fluid and lending more money to homeownership, people will buy much more, I guess. So I think this is the tendency lately.
Thank you, Miguel, for this really wide-spreading set of responses. And I think the situation in Spain is certainly special in some ways, while also showing many correspondences with what's happening in other places. And it's always good to bring back the question to who owns that and how those operators and that lords are very much also shifting between countries and focusing on these global cities like that can be Madrid, Barcelona, or Berlin. So maybe Armin, if you would like to respond to the questions, we have a few minutes. You can probably take up to 5. Can the organizers nod at me saying if we can take a few minutes?
I think we can be
longer.
a little bit flexible. It's not as if for all the attending it's okay. We can take 5 to some more minutes more. No problem.
Fantastic. Thank you, Luisa. So yes, Armin. So Luisa and Rita's questions to you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I tried to be short. About the question of depoliticization by financialization, I'm not so, I have my doubts about this hypothesis, because I think this the story of the Berlin tenant movement is quite directing to the opposite, and also of my like personal experience as an activist. I found that the gentrification discourse was a lot more depoliticizing than the financialization, because this gentrification discourse had this aura of naturality, that would be a natural process, that inner city districts, which are very popular by a lot of people, have a rent increase, and there are artists going there and make it all more attractive. And so what can you do about it? I had this expression a lot by an activist here, where we had really like meetings with 100 people, and everybody said in the end, oh, maybe we have to close our autonomous spaces because they attract the people and are a factor for gentrification. I mean, this kind of depoliticizing debates. And in financialization, or like the showing up of real estate companies and international investors and really rich people buying up the city, has a lot more like scandalizing potential than the gentrification discourse, for instance. And that's my experience also, that when tenants get a letter, your house is sold, and they find out that it's sold to a big real estate company or to investor, these tenants are like ready to do everything, and they only need a little organization structure to get something done. So I don't know about the support of this. And yeah, the question of the impact of the court decision and the expropriation campaign. Yeah, it's a funny relation between the struggles for rent cap and for expropriation campaign, because the rent cap was really a reaction to the expropriation campaign in the first instance, because especially the Social Democrats, they as magicians had the idea of the rent cap in a moment where the expropriation campaign was starting to rally, with the intention to give a more moderate instrument against the housing crisis than this radical demand for expropriation. And but it didn't demobilize obviously the movement in the country, because this was an experience of success. We can do something with our campaign, and even the court decision wasn't a demobilizing moment, because the same day the court decision was published, more than 10,000, I think even 15,000 people went to the street and said, okay, and now expropriation. But still, it's not guaranteed that the fight for expropriation is going to be won this September, far from being guaranteed. And now the question of rent is on the federal level, and now it is the big question if the movement is able to scale up. And this is an ongoing process of organization on federal level since about 10 years. Very slow process, very difficult, because people don't have time, really, don't have resources to organize on federal level, because the organization and the struggles on local level are already so demanding that there are hardly people willing to be involved in this kind of federal alliance building, which is very difficult because conditions are very different between the cities. It's very difficult to find a point where everyone is like satisfied with to rally on. And but still, there are like the steps we made in like parallel decentral action days in the last years, which were rising. We have constant like weekends every year. Right to the City Forum is called, where activists from different cities in Germany meet, about 250 activists from different cities meeting and discussing. And we are now planning a big manifestation in September to yeah, set a sign in the electoral campaign going on. And I also wanted to present it. I can show it to you. This is like the poster for the next manifestation. So on 11th of September, and that's a try to lift up the struggle on the federal level, but only in a dimension of giving a push. It's not really probable that there's going to be an equal kind of organization really intervening in public processes as it is going on in Berlin in the last years.
Thank you. Great poster, by the way. Are there any follow-up questions or comments on these responses or on any of the conversations in this section? I'm sure we can also kind of come back to some of this in the Q&A in the second part, but I think if not, then I might just wrap up this first part and we can have a brief coffee break, which would be nice to do in person, but of course that's not the case. Claire, thank you, Claire, for coming. Greetings from Barcelona, who cannot stay. And yeah, so shall we take a 10 minutes break now and rejoin at 10 to 6? Sorry, yeah, 10 to 5.
Perfect.
So, well, welcome to the second session of the webinar. And we're going to have two presentations. now too, similar to the first one. And so first, Margherita Grazioli from Gran Sasso Science Institute and Blocchi Precari Metropolitani in Rome will present the paper titled No Health Without Housing, Rome's Urban Squatter in the Pandemic. And Marco Allegra, who's from ICS-ULisboa and the Urban Transitions Hub, will present a paper titled Urban Change, Colectividades and Housing Activism, Research Notes on the Arroyos neighborhood in Lisbon, which is also a neighborhood where I do live, so I'm very keen on hearing him. And so without further ado, Margherita, 25 minutes starting more or less now.
Yes. Thanks a lot for the invite. Just give me a sec to put the presentation in full screen every time with, yeah, I struggle with Zoom and PowerPoint. All right, so again, thanks a lot for having me here. And I'm really glad to bring this presentation that pulls mostly from my activist experience in the collective Blocchi Precari Metropolitani, which is part of the Movimento per il diritto all'abitare in Rome, but it also brings in some elements from my ongoing research at the Gran Sasso Science Institute. So I have kind of divided my presentation in these parts. I hope I will manage with the time. So we'll start by briefly framing the housing crisis in Rome. Then I will show some of the issues that emerged during the pandemic from the perspective of housing squats and housing rights movements. From the side of coping with COVID itself and also actions and campaigns related to it. And in the conclusive part of my presentation, I would like to touch upon the perspectives of national and transnational mobilizations that are being developed by Rome housing rights movements with the slogan No health without housing, senza casa non c'è salute. So I think it's very important to start from the idea that when we speak about the housing issue in Rome, we need to start from debunking the idea that it is an emergency, because the issue of housing in Rome has been present at least since the Second World War in similar terms to which we know to what we know now, because of course the housing issue has always been present, but let's say that we can see a connection from the struggles of the 70s of those internal migrants who were living in the shanty towns that had been created by the fascist demolition of the city center, by urban sprawl, by the war, and so on and so forth. And what we see now, of course, different in terms of social composition, as we will see in a sec, different in terms of some also of the demands that are being done. But again, the, let's say, mismatch between the demand for public housing in Rome and the actual housing stock made available by the national state has been a problem, again, at least since the aftermath of the Second World War. I have to say that Miguel and Armin already gave so many elements that I can, let's say, pass on very quickly, because especially Miguel already has discussed extensively the issues connected to what kind of housing models and welfare regimes have been somehow imposed in Southern European countries, and Rome and Italy, and so Rome are no exception by this point. The fact that there has been a progressive imposition of homeownership as the preferred form of tenure, the fact that housing has become the main asset in the intergenerational transmission of family welfare, as state welfare was made increasingly, let's say, residual and financed. There is also the fact that housing has become a status symbol, a way of reaching residential and income ambitions on an individual and a corporate level. And this resonates a lot with what both Miguel and Armin were saying about the role of landlords when it comes down to eviction, to the opposition against forms of rent control, the lack of solidarity also from what we could define as small owners, not corporate actors. But again, it's the logic behind it, the fact that housing is a commodity and is a source, let's say, of income and of lucrative ambition. And so both ownership culture and housing informality in Rome in different forms are coherent with what we can see in other Southern European countries, which is the fact that they are both generalized response to housing policies that offer no alternatives. At the same time, in Italy, Rome, as happened in other countries, have been connoted by the growth, by the development and the consolidation of collective forms of mobilization against the dearth of public housing. And squatting was one of the most prominent forms of mobilizations. And even though, as we said, we could see there was like a sort of, we tend to speak about the big season of squatting in Rome in the 70s and then back after the financial crisis, it might be said that actually housing rights movements never went away because the situation was always evolving. I cannot stop too much on that, but let's say that there have been structural moves, policy choices that have favored like the growth of the housing crisis, at least since the 80s, if not the 70s themselves, in the same moment when some public housing neighborhoods and buildings were built to, let's say, respond to the demands of those who were living in the shanty towns. We could see a pattern that went in the direction of removing rent regulations and planning restrictions, making as public estates as a declining, forgotten resource. We have seen what Simone and others in the very nice report that was presented during the previous session have described as the privatization of and financialization also of social rented housing, what I describe in my work as the welfare industrial complex. In Italy, there was also a late application of the same logic of Thatcher's right to buy, meaning that still nowadays, regional and city council authorities are massively selling council houses to, they say, cut the debts of these agencies. But the point is that the available housing stock is decreasing while the demand is increasing. So we have again this mismatch that has created all the conditions for the housing crisis to revamp again. On top of that, there is also the issue of the urban agendas concerned with top-down urban regeneration, patterns of touristifications that are very intense in the city of Rome, the fact that in some neighborhoods, especially in the city centers, before the pandemic, it was 4 times easier to find a bed in Airbnb instead of a rental accommodation. And we all know how this would inflate also the rental prices based on the idea that the house is a scarce resource, even though that's not true. So these are all structural conditions, again, that already fed into what we could define the post-2008 housing crisis that was made by what we could define a very mestiza composition subjected to housing precarity, I would say exploitation, because again, people who live in the rental market are often offered, let's say, substandard yet overpriced accommodations, and that end up being housing deprived. So these are people that are stuck in the trap of being ineligible for public housing and unable to access marketized tenure. So we have migrants with manifold statuses. We have some groups within, let's say, the largest migrant composition, especially people of Rome ethnicity and asylum seekers who are usually channeled into differential housing accommodations, if we call them so, like the so-called Roma camps or temporary reception centers, and that so are never channeled within public housing. And then we have those working poor, precarious and informal workers, young single people that are too poor to rent or to buy, and that are also out of the target of social protection that is still based on a household with children model. And I would also like to point out very quickly that also the public housing stock is still modeled on this idea of the family. So for instance, in Rome, it is being said that single people never manage to get a public house, even though they are in very high positions, let's say, for getting this type of benefits. So this is where the new movement of housing squads come into place. After the so-called tsunami tours of 2012-2013, over 70 buildings are currently occupied in Rome for housing purposes. They are either private or public vacant buildings occupied and repurposed collective by groups of individuals and families without the consent of the owner, and often with the logistical, political, and organizational support of housing rights movements. Not always, this is important to point out. Just to give you an idea of what type of buildings we are talking about here, I'm bringing some examples from buildings occupied by housing rights movements. This is Metropolis, a place that many of you know very well and some have even visited personally. And this used to be, for instance, a salami factory. Nowadays, 54 families living there, and there is also a self-managed museum that coexists and co-lives also with the housing units. Then we have Porto Fluviale Occupato. This used to be a former barrack from the aeronautics squads, and it was occupied in 2003. Actually, this year it will be 18 years since the occupation, and again 54 families live in here, and the peculiarity of this place is being in an extremely gentrified neighborhood and area. This is another place, Valle Rifiorita. This is situated in the northern area of Rome. This used to be a former private clinic, and it has been occupied for 8 years now. This one used to be actually a retirement house that was abandoned in 2007, then occupied 5 years after, sorry. 140 families live in this complex that is very big. So these are some examples of the types of buildings that have been reconverted and occupied. And this is another one very close to Metropolis. This used to be a 4-star hotel abandoned by, I think, a Portuguese multinational company that just abandoned the place, fired all the workers, and it was occupied a few months after. So one could say that after this literally tsunami of occupations, the government would respond with sustained housing policies, trying to, let's say, eradicate the squatting phenomenon by giving people an alternative. This was not the case, actually. This is not what happened. It needs to be said that the governance of housing policies in Italy is very complex. As you can see, there are many layers that start, of course, from the national government, and then progressively distribute some responsibilities or forms of jurisdiction to more territorialized institutions. Generally, it can be said that no adequate housing policies were implemented even after this new season of housing crisis and housing struggles. And actually, let's say the more prominent legislation that was made at the national level to tackle with the squatting phenomenon has been the Article 5 of the 2014 National Housing Plan, which is important for what I will say in the second part of this presentation about the pandemic, because this article that was made to, let's say, start the struggle against the illegal occupation of buildings is based on the idea of discouraging existing and prospective squatters by stripping them of social and civil rights, because it basically inhibits it inhibits the relation between the squat's inhabitants and the local institutions by denying them to register their home address in a squatting building, which means being inhibited from accessing every type of local welfare provision, healthcare, school, council estates included, being ineligible for all the ordinary as well as emergency benefits that one could get. You cannot vote without a registered residency address, and also this has become very discriminatory for migrants because a registered address is considered a mandatory requisite for the vast majority of visa and citizenship applications. So this will be very important from what I will say in a moment, because as I said, there was no adequate response to the rampaging housing crisis after the financial recession. And the situation is not going to improve after the pandemic. Actually, we have some indicators that tell us really clearly that the situation that was already at a very critical stage is only going to get worse. We don't have many official figures at the moment, but we have some data that we can take from different indicators. So nowadays we know that 50,000 households living in rental accommodations in Rome, which means 1/3 of the total, have filed the application for the regional and municipal rent bonus. The point is that the few that received it got 245 euros for 3 months. So this is kind of ridiculous, but the point is that 1/3 of the families living in rented accommodations, including public housing, had to ask for this kind of bonus and other checks. The grassroots tenants unions like Unione Inquilini, but also the Unione Sindacale di Base, estimate that 4,500 lawsuits for eviction were opened at Rome's civil tribunal since September 2020. There is the fact that the partial evictions moratorium is ending on June 30 without any type of additional, let's say, bonuses or checks, or without any type of additional provision. And there is lastly the fact that just yesterday the Italian National Institute for Statistics have released some new data that show that there is a huge increase in absolute poverty. And the report said that this increase in poverty is eating exactly the same composition was previously suffering the housing crisis, and I discussed with you before, because the fact, for instance, that they did not have a formal address, a formal job, that they were, again, living in informal manners, excluded them by social protection benefits. So basically there is this trap of poverty and precarity that keeps spinning and spinning, and that creates all the premises for what we will see probably, let's say, after this pandemic stage. So in these few minutes I've left, I would like to discuss with you what happened inside housing squads during the pandemic and some perspectives for the afterward, if we could say so, even though we are still in a fully pandemic stage, but the government is behaving as if we were beyond that. So in the very initial stage of the pandemic, we've had the military quarantine of housing squads, especially those who are not related to housing rights movements. And this was epitomized by what happened in April 2020 when the Selam Palace, one of the largest migrant squads in Rome, was forcibly quarantined by military forces because some residents were positive to COVID. So they decided to lock in all the people inside. So people could not go out, could not go in. There was literally a military cordon around them, as you can see from the picture taken from the Facebook of the organization I am part of. And in that moment, housing rights movements, NGOs, migrant solidarity groups, grassroots trade unions organized solidarity relays to bring food, clothing, water to those locked in, because public authorities did not think to do it for days. So people were locked inside abruptly without having any chance to get out, get in, buy groceries, and so on. And this became quite, let's say, an alarm bell for housing rights movements that started to make a series of action during the pandemic. There is the mobilization, obviously, stage of rallies, demonstration, flash mobs, public assemblies, anti-eviction pickets and blockades. And then there was the level of organizing inside housing squads on a level of the single squads and the local level, for instance. There was the organization of workshops about collective and individual protection against COVID-19, how to sanitize collective infrastructures, how to help kids. And this was sometimes co-managed with NGOs and local institutions. And then there was the mobilization of multi-scalar socio-political networks and coalitions that supported the main campaigns that were opened by the movements during the pandemic, that are No Health Without Housing, Senza Casa Non C'è Salute, and Batti il 5, Beat the 5, that asked the abolition of the Article 5 that I mentioned before. Because try and imagine what meant to be excluded from healthcare during the pandemic and the situation I described so far. If I'm right, I have other 3 minutes. Is that correct, or am I all right? And another turning point during the pandemic was the case of Viale del Caravaggio, one of the biggest housing squads in Rome that has been subjected to a pending procedure of evictions in 2019. The building is owned by Angelo Armelini, that is the representative of an actual dynasty of city builders and developers in Rome, the so-called Palazzinari. We know that nowadays city developers may not have a face, may not have a name, maybe banks, trust funds, and so on. In this case, this is one of the few remaining families of Palazzinari in Rome that has asked for the state to pay her back for not implementing the eviction of the building, where 105 households, 380 people, of whom 80 kids live. And nowadays there is an ongoing struggle for the relocation in public housing, not in emergency accommodations. And it might seem that this struggle is about to be won, but we will be able to see if the campaigns, mobilizations, blockades that we are making during these weeks will succeed. We'll be able to tell you something more probably at the end of the month. But this should be one of the first times when houses are actually obtained. And last but not least, there is the mobilization for a new national housing plan that started with the demonstrations since the lockdown period was over under the Ministry of Infrastructures in Rome. That has went on with a national conference where we tried and elaborate a proposal for a new grassroots housing law. And that is also part, and that is also contained in a petition that is actually still standing on change.org. So to conclude, to wrap up very quickly, we could say that the pandemic shed light on housing as the pivot of all the rights connected to the right of the city. Yet the point is that the post-pandemic recovery policies go exactly in the opposite direction, boosting tourism, giving financial aids to landlords, fostering privatized social housing and the presence of financial actors in housing, also greenwashing operations and so on. So we could be said that the struggle, that the mobilization for new housing policies are based on three cornerstones. A new public housing construction plan based on the reconversion of public estates, also the removal of anti-squatting legislation such as the Article 5. Also, there is a point about curtailing real estate intervention in urban planning, asking for rent control, progressive taxation on private vacancies, and also regulation of tourist accommodations. Nowadays in Italy, we don't have a law about Airbnb, for instance. And then reopening a new season of housing struggles, anti-eviction blockades, rent strikes, and if there's the need to, also hopefully new occupations. So thank you.
Thank you, Margherita. Great overview. And I think it will place very nicely with the case of Lisbon, because we're moving from one of the cities in Europe with the strongest and fiercest tradition of housing movements and squatting to one which has historically been less central to these dynamics, but which on the opposite has been rising in terms of the strength of housing movements during the years previous the pandemic. So what's going to happen, of course, it's early to say. So I will move straight to Marco for the second presentation.
Okay, can you see the slides?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. So good afternoon to everybody. And first, my apologies, because by hearing your presentation, I realized that maybe my presentation is a bit out of place, out of context, in the sense that it's not, if you want, a reconstruction of what is happening in Portugal and Lisbon housing-wise, but it's more about the dynamics of the movement within the movement, let's say, rather than, power relation, the relation between the movement and the authority, etc., etc. Second thing, I'll inevitably present the project more than the results, because they're still working on our conclusion, if you want. And third apology, I think that the issue of COVID is very much on the background of what I'm going to say. I did not really manage to organize the stuff we have into this presentation. And I'll just make some quick observation about COVID, and pretty banal observation about COVID, and then we can talk maybe after the presentation. First, I think that we all have a very clear notion of the impact of COVID on our collective life, and here in Lisbon was not all that different, so I'll skip that. Maybe it's necessary also in relation to what Simone just said and what Miguel and Armin said before, just to introduce a couple of local factors. You have to consider that like in Berlin, the housing crisis came because of the recovery in Lisbon, because of the economic recovery, much more than the crisis. So it's more like Berlin, less like Spain, although it's different from both for the reason Simone just mentioned. In Spain and in Germany, in Rome, or at least in some places, there, you have a much more a larger and more influent and more radical movement than we have here in Lisbon. But anyway, back to COVID. Of course, the lives of the activists have been affected, and the life of social spaces that were important to activists has been affected in all the ways you can expect, and you have observed in your research. Their political activities were limited by lockdown and whatnot, and crucially the possibility of organizing meetings and events, and the functioning of social spaces was disrupted, for example, with all that meant for the finances, for example, of the group, and their possibility to interact daily with people, with a broader audience. And of course, our research was affected because our plan was to do an ethnography, quite a small ethnography of a housing mobilization from September 2019 to, let's say, the summer of 2020. And so, and you see a year later, we're still working on that. So if you want my last and final impression, very, very banal if you want, I think that activism had this dynamic in Lisbon. It was temporarily energized by the pandemic, but a year after, the situation has considerably worse. And I think that it would have been difficult to imagine otherwise. So we'll see for the future. But said that, I'll try to do three things today. First, I present the work that Claudio and I are conducting in this small project called Activist Arroyos. Claudio is among the participants. Second, I'll tell you a few things on how this investigation started. And third, I'll discuss some of the challenges inherent to this work. So to the activism academia nexus, if you want. So what do we do? Our research is part of a larger project. Just a second, I need to. I don't know why about the slides. Okay. Yes. And our project within this larger project, the project Hopes, Simone is one of the coordinators of the project, is our work package, if you want, addresses the link between urban change, the housing movements, and the network Coletividades that has grown in the last 10 years or so in the area of Arroyos, which is a neighborhood in Lisbon. And I'll go back to the idea to the notion of collectividades in a minute. And it seems to me that most studies in this field, so housing activism, let's say, have focused, especially from a social movement studies perspective, they have focused on the way in which urban change triggers activism, and therefore real estate prices go up and people protest. The public space is closed down or diminished, and people protest. A new skyscraper is built or is being planned, and people protest, and so on and so forth. What we do is slightly different in the sense that we want to understand how this triangle works in all directions, if you want. So we want to understand, for example, how urban change is also reflected in the characteristics of housing mobilization. Few examples. Urban change is reflected in the nature of the claims of housing movements. For example, in the idea that housing movements should reclaim people's right to the city and not just housing, okay? Or it is reflected in the urban geography of housing movements. For example, by shifting, the concentration, the shifting, the activists at headquarters in specific areas of the city, due sometimes to urban pressures, but also opportunities, etc., etc. It is reflected in the demographic of social movement. For example, because urban change has brought to Lisbon in the last 10 years a great number of foreigners, and a great number of foreigners in the ranks of activists. Okay. And finally, urban change is reflected in the transnational travel of activist practices. That is, in the way models and forms of activism travel from one reality to another. So this is the general idea, our general goal, if you want. And here's some more detail about the coletividades. The third element of our triangle, urban change, housing activists, is this network of coletividades based in the area of arroyos. So first and foremost, what is a coletividade? A coletividade is a space run by an association or a collective that offers a range of services, mostly social and recreational in nature. And if you're thinking about squats, or if you know Italy about circoli or centri sociali, you're not far from the reality. Of course, the idea of coletividades has a local nuances, if you want, and a local tradition, but we're more or less in that semantic area. And second, some geographic information on the idea of activist arroyos. On your left, you see the red circle indicating the Baixa, the very center of Lisbon downtown. And on your right, you see what we call activist arroyos. To be more precise, this includes the area of Arroyos, Peña da França, Graça, Moraria. I will not elaborate on the characteristics of this area, but just point out a couple of things. On the one side, this is traditionally a rather poor area of the city, especially its southern end, and has remained to this day one of the most affordable areas in central Lisbon. On the other side, the area was invested by, in the last 10 years, let's say, but in a more rapid fashion in the last 5 or 6, I think, was invested by processes of urban renewal, gentrification, touristification, etc., etc. Okay, so today the square of Intendente is one of the key spots for Lisbon's nightlife, at least to the extent it still exists after COVID. And and of course, this is the area where our many collectividades are located. The 4 red dots are 4 key collectividades in our research. So here's a bunch of information about how we're doing the work, but I'll skip it completely just to be aware it's here in case you have some questions about, I don't know, data collection, methodology, etc., etc. Something more interesting is how I think the project started. And also where inevitably it gets personal. So on September 29th, 2019, it was the final day of Lisbon's first housing festival. What was the housing festival? It was a political festival, a month of events designed to showcase housing struggles and mobilize people in Lisbon. And on the final day, a sort of gathering. It was not really like a demonstration, but a gathering, let's call it a gathering, was organized in the city center. And what was my position there? A few coordinates. At the point, I had been working as a researcher on Portuguese housing policy for 3 years, give or take. So I definitely knew a lot of people in the field, including activists, but my work was not related specifically to housing activism. I was a member of the HOPES team, but at the moment I was not actively working for the project. And the main trigger for my participation to the housing festival was actually my membership in my participation to the collective of Sirigaita, a small collectividade near the square of Intendente. I became involved with Sirigaita rather randomly. I think I remember I went to the place for the first time in the beginning of 2019, and I liked it. So after a while, I volunteered to work the door at nights, and I kept doing it for a while. And then during the summer of 2019, Sirigaita was experiencing some troubles. So I stepped up a bit my participation. And long story short, I guess that on September 2019, I could be considered an activist, although I was not involved directly with housing activism. But anyway, and that is the main point, if you want, of our work. What was exactly the link between Sirigaita and the housing festival? The key thing is that the organization of the festival was reliant also on a network of coletividades, on those social spaces, including Sirigaita. A few examples. Both Habita and Stop Despejos relied on the coletividades for their weekly meeting and for other initiatives. Sirigaita is basically the headquarters of Habita in Lisbon. Most of the 60 events of the program, of the festival, took place in these coletividades, Sirigaita, Zona Franca, Desgraça, Gaia, etc., etc. The coletividades offered help in the organization of the festival. Manpower, spaces to meet, benefits to fund the organization, and so on and so forth, making, contacts or equipment available. Last but not least, the people of the coletividades represented the most immediate audience of the mobilization. And of course, many people in Habita and Stop Despejos were also active members of these coletividades. So if you want, these coletividades represented and provided a sort of urban ecosystem that supported the organization of the festival. But let's go back to the final day of the housing festival. This was when this project started, at least in my mind. And later on, I had a few discussions with the other people I knew, including Claudio, including Rita, and I decided that that would be the starting point of my contribution to Hopes. And Claudio, should add, at the point was a member of Stop Despejos and had started his PhD at ICS. And so before Christmas, we decided that we would team up for this work package and started our work between January and February 2020, which of course turned out to be not the ideal moment to start a new project. But anyway, what was my original curiosity, if you want, about the final event of the Housing Festival and the Housing Festival as a whole? Two key questions, two key original questions, if you want. And our work has expanded in a way, but these are the two questions that motivated me at the time. First, I wonder whether a similar event would have been possible in Lisbon 10 or 15 years ago. And second, I wondered whether or not the mobilization, which brought together some 400 or 500 people, give or take, that day, was a success. So the first question pointed to some new features of housing activism. Very quickly, all the facts that I'm already mentioned, the fact that the agenda and the slogans, for example, of the movement have shifted in the meantime, but also, for example, the demonstration actually relied heavily on the contribution of that network of coletividades. And the second element, which was very apparent, was the importance of foreigners in the organization of the event, both on the side of activists per se and of the coletividades, to the extent that we can make a difference between the two, of course. So the first tentative answer to this question, whether or not this mobilization could have been possible in Lisbon 10 years earlier, the first tentative answer was a no. It would have been difficult to imagine the same kind of mobilization in the same city, but 10 years ago, okay? And subsequent research seems to confirm that the idea that this was really the case in many different ways. What about the second question? Whether or not the mobilization was a success. And the tentative answer from this point of view here is probably yes and no. As in many other cases in life, the answer is yes, to the extent that the mobilization proved that housing activism in a way could count on a lot of energies and skills that were provided by a rather large community that was willing to support housing struggles, okay? And from this point of view, I think that the Housing Festival was actually a sort of minor miracle, because especially in the way a lot of people in groups managed to really naturally come together in a way and produce such a rich program in just a couple of months, during summer, I should say. On the other side, the answer is no, because what struck me at the time is that the participation was by and large limited to this community and its immediate audience and context. among which should be included, and I'm stressing this because it's important, all the people, the people in the community of residents that habit and stop the spacious as developed relation with. So it was not just, you know, the very, let's say, the very white young crowd of Arroyos that like to party on Friday nights, but also residents. Okay, but apart from this immediate, you know, audience of contacts, there was not much else. So I think it's not far from the truth to say that on the, and maybe Rita will criticize me about that, to say that on that day you could see in the streets the 100% of the community of activist Arroyos and housing movements, but almost the 0% of the rest of the city, which is something worth thinking about in a city that was at the time experiencing a very severe and generalized housing crisis. So why this failure to go outside, go beyond the rather narrow boundaries of your immediate community, if you want? Food for thought, at least for me. We decided to embark on this project and we still haven't finished, but in the do I have 5 minutes? Yes. In the 5 final minutes of this presentation, I'm going to say a few things about the main methodological challenges inherent to this project. So, how do you handle the relation between activists and academics in a research project? And I'm not talking about a project in which researchers simply observe activists and social movement, because clearly what is needed there is just some structured respect and courtesy. Okay, then you go home, you write your paper, will 90% of the time will be read by your colleagues only, not by the activists. I'm talking here about projects that are supposed to produce results that are important also for the activists. Okay, so a good starting point would be this quote by Giovanni Arrighi, which suggests what I think is an important principle, namely that forms of knowledge are complementary, which means that forms of knowledge are specific. Each partner brings something that the others do not have, and therefore also each one has his own job to do. There should not be confusion or homogenization in a partnership. But on the other side, there is no ranking of knowledge, at least from in principle. If we want to produce something that is useful for all the people involved, then usually we have to patch up different forms, different pieces of knowledge. However, so this is an important thing that Arrighi hits, I think. However, I'm not sure that what Arrighi says works perfectly for our project. And that's why in our work package and in hopes in general, we have researchers, we have activists, and so far so good, but we also have people like myself or Claudio who are both things at the same time. And here I don't mean activist researcher in the sense of a researcher that look with benevolence or enthusiasm towards activists or towards a cause. What I mean is basically myself researching Sirigaita while I work the door. I mean Claudio interviewing his friends of Stop the Spacious the day before the weekly meeting of the collective, okay? And here is where what Arrighi says is not sufficient. Still necessary because you have to keep in mind what your role is, not abandoning one thing for the other, not mixing the two improperly, but it's not sufficient anymore. And then what is? I think that a possible answer is to look at the concept of co-production. Co-production is, as you probably know, is a fancy academic term to say creating things together from scratch in a way. So when I look to our project, what does co-producing mean, or at least for me? A few things. First, co-producing should inevitably mean co-producing for real, building something together that is useful for the parties involved. And I'm saying this exactly because the term is fancy, and therefore it will find its way in projects, article, application, just as a synonym of cooperation, okay? But building stuff together implies overcoming a lot of difficulties, doing a specific kind of hard work, exposing yourself to specific kinds of failures. It means a lot of specific commitment to do that. Second, it means production means establishing relations of familiarity between all the people involved, which is objectively difficult to achieve. However, this familiarity is crucial in the ethnographic sense because it allows you as a researcher to collect the best data and to maximize the impact of your research. And it's important because it's really the only way, working together, to dismantle positive and negative prejudice that you often see between researchers and activism. Finally, not finally, I have 2 more points. Third point, co-producing means deliberately sharing interim results with all the parties involved. What I mean, you cannot expect to collect data and then write a paper that will be published after a couple of years and call that a product of the investigation if you're serious about the idea of co-producing stuff, no? Instead, you need to send your respondents the transcript of the interviews with notes and ask for comments, to discuss preliminary findings with them, to walk them through the entire process so they can really get to know what you're doing, what it's all about, and so on and so forth. Last but not least, all of the above requires time, which is always an issue. In terms of co-production, the real deal would be to get out of the narrow boundaries of a single project or intervention and create a sort of critical mass so that the positive practices that you can maybe develop in vitro within the boundaries of the project can become part of the environment in which the project takes place. And that's the real challenge. From this perspective, our small working package is not sufficient, but HOPES is not sufficient, which is a much larger project. On a positive note, I think that we do have something now in Lisbon that is now broader than that. It's now broader than any single colectividad, it's broader than any single project, etc., because I think that HOPES, for example, is part of a broader picture that has been forming in the last few years. And I mean, this network between activists and researchers activists and activist researchers, mostly working on housing on the academic side, which represent, I think, a critical mass that you can build on. As always, the proof is in the pudding. And from this point of view, I think it's very unfortunate that we have this seminar today at 3 p.m. because today at 8 p.m. Claudia and I will participate, and Rita and others will participate to a meeting to a public meeting on social spaces held at Sirigaita, one of those colectividades, which we have contributed to organize and promote, also based on our project, also based on what was the kind of reflection, the conceptualization, the actual work and the actual relation that we had to develop to do this project. And this meeting will see the participation of most of the colectividades in Lisbon, I think. Which means to me that we're reaching here a very small but critical point in our research trajectory, and we will soon be able to see if our effort in this quite practical forms of co-production is going to bear some fruit or not. And I think I'm done.
Thank you, Marco. I mean, I think it was still relevant for the larger, definitely relevant for the larger discussion in the sense of introducing, especially 2 dimensions. One, the relation between the transformations of the cities and the transformation of movements in this double direction, and the role of all of this in making possible, changing politics. So I think there's quite a lot we can discuss. We can have some time. And So I would open the floor, and we're not that many. So if you want just to open your mic and speak, it's probably the easiest way to go forward. Luisa,
yeah, I will briefly break the ice as always.
Do that.
Yeah, just because I invited you all, and the hope of these days of discussion was exactly this. So to see all these experiences, understand if there are opportunities for us as researchers and most of us as activists to have some input that can be useful to translate in other contexts, or even understand which are the big problems that doesn't enable movements to achieve certain goals. So I think it's very interesting what we have been observing today, and starting from the last example Allegra brought of an expanding, for example, context of housing movement in Lisbon. While other experiences as Rome, that is historically a very big scene of groups resisting against the housing crisis, and then Barcelona and Berlin that had historically and more strongly, more recently, some kind of references, the one to the other. I really go back to the questions I asked at the beginning. It was a bit provocation, but also trying to understand as researchers that other level on the top of something that is most clear for many, and for activists there are many things that are even more clear than for me and for researchers in general. But I mean, what I observed, for example, I was here participating to some stop eviction and let's say tenants movement in my neighborhood. We had several actions to stop evictions around here. It works very well because the example of Barcelona, its powerful idea is this really neighborhood organized system that is really like a network. So there are small groups, each one is just taking care of the area around them and not even taking care of the other one. So like we are in Publisec and we don't, like we sometimes go for a stop eviction in Raval, but not that much because that's supposed to be managed by another group in order to have a strong group that is supported by neighbors. And the idea that neighbors go on the street to defend the neighbor of the door at the side of yours. And that's something that works on one side. On the other side, we see how there is all a system on the top that is very hard to oppose. And when the questions and the goals are structural changes, as in the article of Miguel Martinez about PA, when they try to oppose the recursive system of banks in Spain, that basically when you ask for a mortgage, if you are not able to pay the mortgage anymore, you will lose the house and you will maintain the debt with the bank. So that was, for example, one of the main claim of the PA after the crisis of 2008-2009, that wasn't able to push a change enough. And even if this discourse was put into the political debate, the result wasn't an actual change, because there are these overstructures of financialization that touch all levels of our life, and it's so much entangled with how the state on its different levels works now and manage things. Also about evictions here, for example, the problem was that here are considered small owners that have at least 15 apartments. This is considered a small owner. So if you're a small owner and somebody cannot pay the rent, he will be evicted, because otherwise it's gonna affect the small owner. Since you have 16 to more apartments, then your eviction can be blocked, and that can be discussed. Also that for movements is very complicated to resist. So what I see is mainly creating barricades all the time, but with a very, very slow effect on affecting actual policies and making changes. but also here in Barcelona, and then I just put these comments to go ahead with this. We also saw that the rent law was at the end delivered in the COVID context. It was prepared since before, but for sure the social pressure, I think, that produced the fact that it was finally approved and applied, even if in a very few number of cases, because most of the time it is said that owners resist to that. There are always problems, and as we saw also, there are issues of scalarity of which, if it's municipality or region or the state that should take care of it, etc., etc. So what I want to ask to all of you is, I mean, how do you see in perspective if real subversive proposals are capable to be delivered in this context, in which housing policies have been promoted by the states, proposing basically the same concept that produced the crisis of 2008-2009 and the actual unsustainable situation, as Margherita was mentioning before. I mean, in post-pandemic recovery policies, they go all in opposite direction to what basically social movements were asking. So boosting tourism, financialized, etc., etc. So how do we see this future path? That's a bit the question.
I don't know if Marco and Margherita want to react, or there's someone else who want to adapt before.
The question is really how we see the future. That's a complicated question. I'm not even sure that I'm the most knowledgeable person about that. Anyway, I don't know. Maybe we want to collect.
Maybe someone, I can see Rita's mic is on, so yeah. I don't know if,
yeah, Rita, go for it.
Okay, so just I was hearing Marco, and I was thinking about something that I think connects different presentations. That is, I really believe, and I would like to know your opinion, because you all are studying or doing things in the social movements, that the cultural dynamics of the place, the memory and the political culture, and the memory and the tradition is very important. So I think Barcelona and Berlin and Rome are good examples about places that have a tradition and also a memory that is not dead, and there is a social and political dynamic where, of course, social spaces are crucial. And I think we in Lisbon we are dealing with a different relation about this. That is we have a very old population in the country, and also in Lisbon. I think we are dealing with a problem of aging, very aged population, and also a lack. We don't have alive this political tradition in the youth. So I think these are crucial elements for the mobilizations. And yes, this festival, in fact, that Marco was talking, the aim was not to organize a demonstration, because we did that the year before, and the 2 years before we have done the caravana. So we were trying to mobilize different kinds of participants and actors in these different kinds of mobilizations. And in fact, the festival was trying to do, with a lot of difficulties and errors and whatever, was to try to give some steps in creating this culture. So to try to create links between groups, and to mobilize the youth and the cultural and artistic movement to try to penetrate in this imaginarium, to try to create a new imaginarium that we are lacking here. So it was not even very well. I wanted to know your opinion about this, that's why I think that Berlin, for example, is much more active than I don't know, other city like other city in Germany, or that Barcelona is much more active than other places in Spain. I think there are political cultures, and they are very important. And with this process of gentrification, of course, we are losing it. And this is crucial for the movement. That's it.
Yeah. I was okay. I will add something myself before giving the word to Marco and Margherita, which is also in terms of what Rita was saying, and having been me too in Lisbon and observing earlier on, participating more, later on observing more the housing movements in Lisbon, and their actually impressive growth in terms of rate, of pace of growth during the last few years. But it's easy to think that we are strong and powerful. But the point is, also in terms of the question that Luisa was making, that there is really a huge distance between the actual capacities of movements, which as movements, I believe in places like Rome, in Spain, but even in Portugal, are becoming strong in sense of capacity of movements, of pushing for specific transformations. But then there is an entire different thing, which is building hegemony for changing things for good. And so in terms of being able to obtain victories, stopping evictions, having this specific law approved, etc., I think there's different ways and different trajectories to which different movements have been effective, but more or less they've been becoming more effective during the last decade. Changing things structurally, it's probably even harder now than it was a few years ago. And that's interesting, even in terms, for instance, in terms of what I've seen with movements in Italy, particularly in Turin, where it seems there is an increased detachment between movements activism and the rest of the social world. In many senses, in the sense that much of the mainstream political understanding about movements is they are criminal, they're radical, we don't want to talk with them, but also in terms of we don't want to negotiate with that part of the world and that fracture. While in a place like Lisbon, there is definitely much more dialogue between movements and former politics, but from a position of stronger weakness. So if then the challenge that Luisa was asking about is how to build hegemony for changing significantly housing, in this specific sense, I'm not seeing much progresses being achieved for, at the very least, in Italy and in Portugal. Maybe in Spain, there has been moments when, or in Berlin too, when they were getting closer to that, but still, as Miguel was arguing, in terms of even the French government completely disregarding that is a signal that even there it's hard. Of course, I have no answers. It was just complicating the things a bit more. And I would like to hear from Margherita, especially on Rome and how it plays in Italy, maybe. And then react to everything else.
Thanks. These were very nice questions, actually, that touched, I mean, Rita's comment touched upon the past, the memory, the tradition, and then what Luisa and Simone discussed about, I mean, the future and what we can see ahead of us. So maybe I will start from the last question before I move to the first one, because I wanted just to add a bit on what Rita was saying about the fact that I think one of the peculiarities of housing rights movements in Rome has been this capacity of retaining memory, tradition, and tradition in the sense of a repertoire also of, let's say, demands, organizational skills, but also I would say even memories, like having some figures of the housing struggle, like Fabrizio Ceruso, for instance, or other militants who were killed in the 70s during evictions, that become part, let's say, of a shared identity of of the movement, and at the same time being capable of adapting these practices to a different social composition, because I didn't have the time to get much into this, but think how the heterogeneity, the mestizeness of these movements reflects, for instance, on something like an assembly, where you have to make sure that people understand each other, that there is a shared language, that people can, as much as possible, understand everything that's going on, and have, let's say, equality in deciding all together. So there is an evolution of the practices, of the repertoire of practices, but also of the demands, because I think, and this pertains to the second question, that part of thinking what could be victories or future perspectives comes down also to understanding that some also of the more, let's say, traditional rooted demands need to be updated and changed, because what I can see, some days ago I was talking with some women who live in Viale del Caravaggio, the place that I showed to you, and where from which people will probably obtain the victory of going into public housing apartments. And many of them were telling me that they were having mixed feelings about moving out, because the idea of going into an apartment, living alone, being detached from their community, not doing the assembly anymore, not sharing childcare, is something that was scaring them. And especially with their younger children that grew inside the housing squads, they said, in the same position where they found themselves year before, when they had to explain to their now older children that they had to move out of the house they had rented because they couldn't pay the rent anymore, and so on. Because maybe it's the first time now these movements have managed to keep, let's say, housing squads for years, many years. So there are children, people who have grown up in that place, and so that have a different idea of what public housing could and should be. So it's not just a roof in a building in a certain area, but there is an idea of commonality, of infrastructures of care, of social reproduction behind it, that it's very different. So when we think about something, about the type of demands that we do also for new housing policies, we need to take into consideration also these elements. So I think that the only viable, and this is a part, of course, of a collective reflection, not only individual, but exactly this idea of reusing what's already in the city, vacancies, infrastructures that are not even designed for residential purposes, but taking what's there, it's not used, it's going to waste, and put it to a different use. It can be the way out, because it can be an environmentally sustainable solution. It would avoid further urban sprawl, because Rome, I mean, has sprawled, I mean, so much that we don't even know anymore where the borders of Rome are. And it's also not good to think that public houses should be built, let's say, that we keep building and creating cities where new peripheralities and marginalities are imagined. So reusing what's there in the city, I think it's the way of asking for viable housing policies. And I think it's there that you can have the result. And in fact, I will close on this to see just the future. The houses that will be used to relocate the 105 families of Viale del Caravaggio are what are called in derogatory terms case di risulta, that were public houses that were closed, not being maintained, not taken care for, just left there, part of that big housing stock that is abandoned. We are trying to replace the narrative. This is not a negative thing. Those are not bad houses. Those are houses that should have been used before and now are put to use. And I think that's the way of trying and win something in the future.
Marco, bye Armin. I see. So thanks.
Yes, I'll start by Rita's comments because, well, I think I said that in my presentation was not a demonstration. I understood how it was organized, but my surprise was that even if it was conceived in this way, it did not rapidly overflow, digamos, in the sense that, for example, I mean, all my colleagues in that moment at ICS were, or in other universities, and people my generation, more or less my condition, Portuguese and foreigners, were constantly bitching about their housing problems, about the rents, about the fact that the landlord was going to ask for a raise, etc., etc. But this, to my surprise, I was not so surprised, but you know, I got the contradiction here, did not immediately flew into the domain of mobilization. And I think that, yes, what Rita said is very important. I agree 100% in the sense that, well, there are objective factors in terms of history, tradition, etc., but also in terms of the political culture. And this is very important. And to some extent, I think that in Lisbon, while the housing movement has not succeeded on a scale that is comparable, for example, to Rome, to Berlin, to many cities in Spain. I mean, the comparison, a quantitative comparison, would be ridiculous in a way, because if we compare the stats of Habita and the stats of the PA, we're talking two different universes in many ways. But I think that, and this connects a bit to the future, what the future could bring. I think that it was successful in the sense, precisely in the sense that Rita described. So the housing movements in Lisbon is starting a bit, or better, as embarked in a way on a route to create that kind of shared culture that can, you know, that can make a not maybe hegemonic, but can make, you know, respectable and more effective the housing mobilization. And I think, and this is what I thinking about when I'm thinking about the idea that we now have in Lisbon a sort of critical mass that can, you know, be on which potential we can build on, in a sense. The only problem, and here maybe COVID is coming back into the game, is that it's a very small critical mass, and very small critical masses, in my experience, they are at risk of, you know, just going underwater at every little, you know, a wave that is slightly larger than the ordinary would just submerge them. And of course, my preoccupation, the risk of the current situation is that COVID might be that kind of wave, in the sense that we should, I think that, as I said, my overall judgment on COVID is that we're suffering very much by it, and on the specific, you know, political terrain, in this sense, so the terrain of activism and what goes around activism. So remain, of course, skeptical in the future, but you know, it's good to be able to see some possibilities in the present, so to speak.
Thanks, Marco. I think, I mean, unless someone wants to add, maybe Miguel from the first session, or someone else.
Mara raised her hand.
Mara, sorry, yes, you have the hand. Bad share.
No problem, no problem. It was just I just wanted to make a short comment in response to what Margherita was saying, and it's something that I've also seen in terms of activism in Barcelona, is that, and perhaps maybe just to continue opening up this question about what COVID might or might not be generating. And it's this question of the kind of the prefigurative element of this occupation and these forms of organizing and these relations that are being formed through mobilizations, and how then they become translated only partially in the sort of responses that we receive as activists. And so that can be as different as, you know, as someone who has grown up and brought up children in a vast and very thick and dense form of relationality and mobilization and politicization, which then gets given a flat in a different area in this very hyper-individualized understanding of housing rights, to just generally the sense of what kind of rights are we fighting for, and how much landscape there is still there to cover in terms of the institutional responses, in a moment where mobilization also means production of new collective subjectivities, and not just a question of demanding something. It's also, there is that transformative element. And it's just a reflection around the paradoxical situation of COVID and the stay at home and the impossibility of staying at home, bringing interdependency much more to the fore politically, and whether or not we're going to see more of a retreat, which will be justified by the sort of political economic dimension into individual home ownership, or whether we're going to see a shift towards perhaps forms of housing which are going to be more attuned to this interdependency. I don't know, I'm always hopeful about this and this possibility of translating that in the future. It was more of a comment, really.
Miguel, yes, please.
Well, it's a bit late. I also have to leave, but I would like to say that the presentations today gave us also hope, because they are showing that housing struggles are very vibrant, and they are moving a lot of things. That if we compare this with 20 years ago in many cities of Europe, we will be surprised. I think we are in a better stage in that respect, many more connections with other movements, more visibility. So I think this is quite positive. But on the other hand, I always like to take the historical pessimism in which most movements have peaks and valleys. You cannot expect to be always at the top of the peak, because it's many things are going to change. Capital never changes. I mean, capitalism is there, is growing. Growth is the only motto for capital, and they do as much as they can. So somehow my hope comes from understanding movements from different angles and different kind of struggles all together in different periods. Sometimes you have to change your strategies, but the strategies are always basically targeting the same, targeting the accumulation of capital and the policies that favor the accumulation of capital. So you can interfere capital by occupying a building or by occupying thousands of buildings, but it's not always easy to occupy thousands of buildings. And it's not always easy to build something new once you occupy a building. So these are the differences of the periods, of the periods, the cycles of the struggles, right? But you need to target that. Sometimes you occupy because you are building something new, a prefigurative movement, but sometimes you occupy because there are no other options and everything is so close. And if you are lucky, you can occupy with a community, but very often, and this is what we are experiencing in Spain lately, is you occupy individually, but it could be a movement, and sometimes different forms of organization can also support this kind of individual occupations, even if they are not creating something new. So I think we need to be like a guerrilla and try to use all the possibilities. If we have the chance to change the legislation about housing and to regulate rents or to expropriate the big landlords, let's go to do it. But this is just one of the possible angles and the possible struggles. And it's difficult to radicalize movements to that extent, but sometimes there are opportunities for that. If we can do a squatting, let's do it. But sometimes a squatting is not the most mobilizing tool, because many people are scared because the stereotypes, the stigmas. And you see that I've been in the movement in many moments of retreat when we were very marginal. And it was disheartening to go to demonstrations of just a few people almost every week, right? Or things like that. So I think that to conclude that I have to leave, sorry, but it's fantastic that you managed to put us together. It would be much better to be face to face, of course, because we could have more discussions and conversations afterwards. But I think this is a symptom of something which is changing definitely, and also in academia, that there is much more attention to this phenomena than before. So something good is happening, I guess.
Thanks, Miguel. I think I will close it here because Zoom fatigue is a thing and 3 hours is more than enough. And just putting the link there of the next event we organize with the UTH, which is different. It's next week. Feel free to join if you're interested. We will be discussing, Luisa, you want to say something?
I
Yes.
just wanted to say that the idea is also to have an event this winter. Hopefully it could be in person and keep on talking about this topic, and even maybe have people presenting papers and think about collective publication if you're interested about it. I think it was a very interesting discussion. Thank you all for joining us, even if we lost many participants during the discussion, but yet thank you very much. And I hope that, yes, this I think that the path for the future is also to build a network that can be crossing states. Since we are into a European system, maybe also the struggle should be at some point connected, even if it's very difficult because they're very local. But I mean, discussing this way maybe can be a contribute to that. So, well, thank you everybody for participating today.
Thank you.
And hope to see you again.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
See you soon.